Most people think they know how the war on drugs started. They picture a single press conference in June of 1971, Richard Nixon standing at a podium declaring drug abuse public enemy number one, launching a decades-long crackdown that filled American prisons and tore apart black communities. It's a clean story with a clear villain, a cynical president who later turned out to be a criminal himself, and a clear motive, laid out years later in a single explosive quote from one of his own advisors. It's the version you'll find in documentaries, op-eds, and viral social media posts. But that story is incomplete, and in some important ways, it starts about 100 years too late. The war on drugs wasn't invented in a single press conference. It was the culmination of a century of overlapping forces, waves of anti-immigrant panic that got funneled into specific drugs, a federal bureaucrat who spent 3 decades building his own empire on racialized fear, a genuinely cynical political calculation that historians still argue over the exact wording of, and a national tragedy involving a college basketball star that rewrote federal sentencing law almost overnight. None of this erases the real devastation the drug war caused. But if you only start the story in 1971, you miss almost everything that made 1971 possible, and you miss just how much of what actually happened doesn't fit neatly into the story you've been told either way. So let's go back, not to Nixon's podium in 1971. Let's go back to San Francisco in the 1870s. In the years after the Civil War, thousands of Chinese immigrants had settled in California, many recruited to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Among the customs some brought with them was the smoking of opium, typically in dedicated dens. White Americans mostly ignored this until an economic downturn in the 1870s turned Chinese immigrants into convenient scapegoats for job competition and social anxiety. In 1875, San Francisco passed what's widely considered the first drug law in American history, an ordinance banning opium dens. It wasn't primarily about opium's chemistry or its health effects. It was, transparently, about controlling a specific immigrant population. Other West Coast cities followed with similar ordinances, and by 1909, Congress passed the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act, a federal ban aimed specifically at the smokable form of opium associated with Chinese immigrants, while opium in patent medicines, consumed mostly by white, often middle-class Americans, including many women, remained perfectly legal for years afterward. The chemistry of the drug wasn't the deciding factor. Who was using it was. This pattern would repeat, with remarkable consistency, for the next 100 years. In 1914, Congress passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, technically just a tax and record-keeping law for opiates and cocaine, but one the Treasury Department and the courts quickly interpreted as a near-total prohibition. Here again, the law didn't emerge in a vacuum. It followed decades of sensational newspaper coverage linking cocaine to black Americans in the South, with some papers running lurid and later debunked claims that cocaine gave black men superhuman strength and immunity to bullets, feeding directly into the political will to criminalize the drug nationally. The Harrison Act became the legal template, using federal tax power to enforce what was really a police power the Constitution hadn't clearly given Congress, that almost every major drug law since has followed. Now let's talk about the man historians consider the true architect of the modern drug war, and it's someone whose name is far less well known than Nixon's: Harry Anslinger. Anslinger became the first commissioner of the newly created Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930, a position he would hold for an almost unbelievable 32 years, serving 5 different presidents. Early in his career, Anslinger actually dismissed the idea that marijuana caused violence or insanity as an absurd fallacy. But once he took charge of an agency that needed a mission to justify its existence, his position reversed completely. Marijuana use in the early 1930s was relatively rare in most of the country, concentrated largely in Mexican immigrant communities in the Southwest and in black jazz communities in cities like New Orleans and Harlem. Anslinger built his campaign directly on top of that association. He deliberately popularized the Spanish-derived word marijuana instead of the more clinical cannabis, specifically to tie the drug in the public imagination to Mexican immigrants. In his own writings and testimony preserved in his agency's archives, he described the drug's users in explicitly racial terms, linking marijuana to what he called the satanic influence of jazz music, and citing sensational, largely fabricated crime stories, including the case of Victor Licata, a Florida man who killed his family in 1933, a killing Anslinger blamed on marijuana despite Licata's documented, pre-existing severe mental illness having nothing to do with the drug. In 1937, largely on the strength of Anslinger's congressional testimony, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively criminalizing cannabis nationwide. The only expert witness to testify against the bill, a physician representing the American Medical Association, was dismissed and mocked by the committee. Decades later, in the 1994 Harper's interview we'll get to shortly, even Nixon's own advisor would describe this general strategy, tying drugs to specific populations in the public mind, as a knowing and deliberate tactic, not a coincidence. It's worth pausing here, because this is where a good telling of this story has to hold two things at once. The racialized origins of these early laws are not speculation or exaggeration. They're documented in the legislative record, in newspaper archives, and in Anslinger's own agency's files. But it would also be a mistake to treat every early drug law as having no basis in genuine, if often exaggerated, public health concern. Opiate addiction was a real and growing problem in early 20th century America, partly a legacy of Civil War-era morphine use and the freely available opiates in over-the-counter patent medicines. The tragedy is that a legitimate public health issue got wrapped in, and often overwhelmed by, racial panic from the very beginning. And that combination, more than either factor alone, is what actually built the legal machinery of prohibition. By the 1950s, that machinery had already produced its first wave of mandatory minimum sentences, under the Boggs Act of 1951 and the Narcotics Control Act of 1956, decades before Nixon or Reagan. So when people trace mandatory minimums back to the 1980s, they're skipping an entire earlier chapter. One Congress itself would later repeal, with bipartisan support in 1970, on the grounds that the mandatory minimums simply weren't working and were filling prisons with low-level users rather than major traffickers. Which brings us, finally, to Richard Nixon. By the late 1960s, Nixon was running for president against a backdrop of urban unrest, a bitterly divisive war in Vietnam, and a rapidly growing counterculture. His 1968 campaign leaned heavily on the language of law and order, a phrase that, depending on who you ask, was either a genuine response to rising crime rates, which were in fact real and rising sharply through the late 1960s, or coded language aimed at anxious white voters uneasy about civil rights gains and anti-war protest, or, as is usually the case with successful political messaging, some blend of both simultaneously. In June of 1971, Nixon held the press conference that gives this video its popular starting point, declaring drug abuse public enemy number one, and announcing a new, coordinated federal push against it. And this is where the popular version of the story usually jumps straight to the most quoted piece of evidence in the entire war on drugs narrative, a comment attributed to John Ehrlichman, Nixon's chief domestic policy advisor, and later, one of the convicted Watergate conspirators. In a 2016 Harper's Magazine article, journalist Dan Baum wrote that in a 1994 interview, Ehrlichman told him plainly, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. That quote has been shared, screenshotted, and cited millions of times since 2016, and it's become the single most repeated piece of evidence for the claim that the entire war on drugs was, from its very first day, a knowing and cynical act of racial and political repression with nothing to do with actual drug policy. And here's what a responsible telling of this story has to say clearly. Historians who study this period urge real caution about that quote, for reasons worth understanding rather than dismissing. Ehrlichman died in 1999. Baum didn't publish the quote until 2016, 22 years after the interview took place, and 20 years after Baum's own 1996 book about the drug war's origins, a book in which Ehrlichman is discussed extensively, but this specific quote never once appears. Ehrlichman's surviving children have publicly and forcefully disputed that their father ever said anything like it, or held views resembling it. And historians who've dug into the actual documented record of Nixon's drug policy have pointed out something that rarely makes it into the viral version of this story at all. Nixon's own administration, in practice, did not primarily pursue the punitive, enforcement-only approach that quote implies. In fact, this next part genuinely surprises most people. Nixon appointed a physician named Dr. Jerome Jaffe to head a new Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention, and under Jaffe's direction, the Nixon administration became the first in American history to fund methadone treatment at scale, opening the first legal opiate maintenance clinics since the 1920s. By Nixon's own account to Congress in 1971, treating narcotics addiction as purely a law enforcement problem was, in his words, a common oversimplification. The federal budget numbers back this up in a way that complicates the standard narrative considerably. In 1970, the federal government spent roughly $60 million on drug treatment and prevention, compared to $53 million on enforcement and interdiction, treatment already slightly ahead. By 1973, Nixon's last full year in office, that gap had widened dramatically, $466 million on treatment and prevention, compared to just over $100 million on enforcement. For most of his presidency, Nixon's administration was spending roughly 2 out of every 3 federal drug control dollars on treatment and rehabilitation, not punishment. He also oversaw the repeal of most of the federal mandatory minimum sentences that had been on the books since the 1950s. None of this erases the other side of Nixon's drug policy. He did create the Drug Enforcement Administration in 1973, consolidating federal drug enforcement into a single, more powerful agency. Federal narcotics arrests did roughly double between 1969 and 1972. And it's entirely possible, even likely, given everything else we know about the political culture of that era, that racial and political calculation played some genuine role in how the drug issue was framed publicly, even if the single viral Ehrlichman quote overstates and oversimplifies exactly how and how consciously that happened. The honest answer here is genuinely more complicated than either the cynical racist conspiracy from day one story or the compassionate reformer story that Nixon's modern defenders sometimes tell. Nixon's actual drug policy, in the numbers, looks less like an all-out war and more like a public health initiative with an increasingly aggressive law enforcement arm attached to it. A combination that would not survive the decade that followed. Because it's what came after Nixon that actually built the drug war most people picture when they hear that phrase. Through the late 1970s and early 1980s, cocaine use, and eventually crack cocaine, a cheaper, smokable form of the drug that emerged in urban areas in the mid-1980s, spread rapidly, and with it came a very real rise in violence in cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C., driven by turf wars among competing dealers. Then, in June of 1986, University of Maryland basketball star Len Bias, just drafted second overall by the Boston Celtics and on the verge of superstardom, died of a cocaine overdose, initially and incorrectly reported by much of the media as a crack overdose, when a later trial established it was powder cocaine. The death shocked the country and triggered what historians and journalists alike have called a media and political frenzy. Then Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill, whose district bordered Bias's home, moved with extraordinary speed to draft sweeping anti-drug legislation. Within months, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, and Ronald Reagan signed it into law. The bill moved so quickly that, according to a later analysis by the U.S. Sentencing Commission itself, no committee held meaningful hearings on its central provisions before it passed. And buried inside it was a number that would define drug sentencing in America for the next quarter century. A 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. 5 grams of crack, roughly the weight of a few sugar packets, triggered the same mandatory 5-year federal prison sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine, more than a pound. Chemically, crack and powder cocaine are essentially the same drug in different forms, but crack was cheaper, more accessible in poorer urban neighborhoods, and disproportionately used and sold by Black Americans, while powder cocaine remained more associated with wealthier, often white users. The result was almost immediate and stark. By the early 1990s, more than 80% of those sentenced federally for crack offenses were black, despite the U.S. Sentencing Commission's own later data showing the majority of crack users nationally were white or Hispanic. 27 federal judges would eventually write to Congress calling the disparity impossible to justify. It would take until 2010, the Fair Sentencing Act, for Congress to even reduce that ratio from 100 to 1 down to 18 to 1, and it took until 2018's First Step Act for that reduced sentencing to apply retroactively to people already serving the old, harsher terms. Now let's bring all of these threads together, because the true story of the war on drugs isn't a single decision made by a single cynical man in a single year. You had a foundational pattern, set in the 1870s and repeated in 1909 and again in 1914, of drug laws following racial and immigration anxiety rather than pharmacology. You had Harry Anslinger, an unelected bureaucrat who held federal power for 32 years, building an entire agency's mission and budget on the deliberate racialization of a plant most Americans had never heard of. You had a genuinely contested and much abused single quote from a disgraced Watergate figure, repeated so often it's often mistaken for settled historical fact rather than a disputed second-hand account published decades after the fact. You had a presidential administration whose actual documented policy, heavy on treatment funding, light on mandatory minimums, doesn't fit comfortably into either the villain or hero version of the story. And you had a piece of legislation written and passed within months, in the emotional aftermath of one young man's death, that would go on to reshape federal sentencing along racial lines for a generation, largely on the basis of assumptions about crack cocaine that turned out, on later examination, to simply be wrong. What historians get wrong when they tell this story quickly is picking one villain and one moment and building the entire narrative around it, whichever direction that narrative runs. The Nixon said the quiet part out loud version flattens 100 years of racialized drug policy into a single 1994 quote of disputed provenance. The opposite version, that the drug war was simply a good-faith public health response that got a little overzealous, ignores Anslinger's documented decades of racialized fear-mongering and the genuinely indefensible math behind the crack powder disparity. The real story runs through both truths at once. Real public health crises, repeatedly and predictably filtered through racial anxiety, administered by institutions and individuals who often believed, or told themselves, that they were solving a genuine problem, while building policies that consistently, disproportionately fell on the same communities, decade after decade. It's worth sitting with the human cost of this for a moment, because the statistics alone can numb you to what they actually represent. In 1980, the total U.S. prison population, state and federal combined, was around 500,000 people. By the early 2010s, it had climbed past 2.2 million, and drug offenses were, for decades, the single largest driver of that growth in the federal system. Legal scholar Michelle Alexander's widely cited research on this period documented how a young black man in many American cities faced dramatically higher odds of arrest and prosecution for drug offenses than a white peer using at similar or even higher rates. Not necessarily because any single officer or prosecutor set out to discriminate, but because decades of policy, resource allocation, and legal precedent had built a system that produced that outcome as a matter of course. That's the part that rarely makes it into a 5-minute explainer video. The drug war's damage wasn't primarily inflicted through dramatic, identifiable acts of malice. It was inflicted through thousands of small, procedurally neutral decisions. Where to patrol, what quantity triggers a mandatory sentence, which neighborhoods get treated as a public health problem, and which get treated as a crime scene, compounding over generations. And there's a final, uncomfortable parallel worth naming before we close. Beginning in the mid-2010s, as America's opioid crisis exploded, driven initially by prescription painkillers marketed heavily to largely white, often rural and suburban communities, the national conversation shifted noticeably. Addiction increasingly got discussed in the language of public health, of grieving families, of a disease that deserved treatment and compassion, rather than prison. That shift in tone was, in many ways, overdue and correct. But it's difficult not to notice that the same drug, opioids, provoked a fundamentally different policy response, depending largely on who was using it and when. That's not a new observation historians are making about this particular crisis. It's the same pattern that runs, in one form or another, through San Francisco's opium ordinances in 1875, Anslinger's marijuana campaign in the 1930s, and the crack powder disparity of 1986. The chemistry of the drug has rarely been the deciding factor in how harshly America chose to punish it. That's really the honest lesson of the war on drugs. It wasn't switched on in a single press conference, and it wasn't the product of one man's hidden confession decades after the fact. It was built, piece by piece, over a century, by a pattern that kept repeating because it kept working politically, treating a real public health problem as a law enforcement problem for whichever community was using the drug least sympathetically in the public eye at that particular moment. Understanding that pattern doesn't require believing every drug law in American history was passed in bad faith. It requires noticing how consistently good faith concern and racial anxiety have traveled together in this country's drug policy, and asking why, every time reform has finally arrived, in 1970, in 2010, in 2018, it's arrived years or decades after the damage was already done. If this deeper version of the story was worth your time, subscribing genuinely helps more people find it. We've got several more of these true origin breakdowns in the pipeline, digging into the parts of American history that usually get flattened into a single viral quote or a 5-minute video. And since we know we've got people watching from all over the country on this one, drop a comment and let us know what city or state you're texting from. It's always worth seeing just how far a story like this actually travels. See you in the next one.